How can you create a life you don't need a vacation from? What can we learn from the French about slowing down, savoring meals, and making conversation the heart of gatherings? And what's it like moving your family thousands of miles to uproot and live in the south of France, in the heart of the Languedoc wine region? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Steve Hoffman, who has written an award-winning memoir called A Season for That, Lost and Found in the Other Southern France. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover what tax preparation and writing have in common, what inspired Steve to write about the Languedoc, which he refers to as the other Southern France, the major hurdles to getting A Season for That published, how Steve shifted from an article to a book mindset, what helped Steve find the balance between writing beautifully and needing to move the story forward, important lessons Steve learned from his editor, the respected cookbook author Francis Lam, insights about French parenting and family life that Steve continues to apply, how Steve chose the village he wanted to live in, how vulnerability and curiosity help with cultural immersion, and why vulnerability is the key to connecting with readers. I'll say amen to that. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 348. On CTV Morning Live, I recently talked about celebrating summer's bounty and pairing wines with farmers market finds. You know, as we dive into summer entertaining, the farmers markets are overflowing with fresh fruit and vegetables, so you might be looking for some wines to pair with those local treasures. I'm here to help. We're diving into a farm-to-glass adventure and focusing on Canadian and Italian wines today, as both are known for their zesty, garden-friendly styles. We're starting with something crisp and coastal. It's Youst's Blue Latitude from Nova Scotia. Blue Latitude is a white wine blend that's breezy and bright with notes of green apple, lime zest, and an ocean-fresh minerality. This wine is sensational, with a farmer's market sweet corn and cherry tomato salad tossed with fresh basil and goat cheese. Fascinating fact, Youst Vineyards is the oldest winery in Nova Scotia, founded in 1983. It's located along the Northumberland Strait, and the constant coastal breezes help to keep the grapes dry and healthy. That makes Youst one of the most sustainable vineyards in Canada. Nature's air conditioning at its finest. Just like shopping at farmers markets, it's all about supporting sustainable, local producers who care about their craft and the environment. Side note, you can order Youst directly from the winery, from their website, or by calling them, and they'll ship to your doorstep anywhere in Canada. So what if we want some bubbles to go with our market haul? Falinari Prosecco, a sparkling wine from Italy, is perfect for patio sipping and entertaining. It has aromas of white peach, citrus blossom, and fresh fruity bubbles. Try it with peach slices wrapped in prosciutto or a platter of sliced nectarines, cucumber ribbons, and a burrata cheese. Fascinating fact, the Falinari family has been making wine for over 200 years. Their vineyards are located in the rolling hills of Treviso, where the Glera grape thrives. This extra dry style is also ideal for spicy snacks and salty cheeses. So what's next for our farmers market feast? Tidal Bay is Nova Scotia's signature wine, and this one from 1365 Church Street Winery is a benchmark example. It's vibrant and aromatic with notes of citrus peel, green herbs, and white flowers. Serve it with zucchini fritters, a cucumber dill salad, or herbed chev on rye crackers. Fascinating fact: 1365 Church Street is one of Nova Scotia's newest and most innovative producers. Their Tile Bay uses 100% estate-grown grapes that are aged in stainless steel to retain their fruit freshness and expression. And what if we're leaning toward Mediterranean veggies? Well, next we have this delightful Villa Sparina Gavi de Gavi made from the Cortese grapes grown in the northern region of Piedmonte, so it's fresh and clean. It has lovely notes of lime and lemon zest. This wine sings with a classic caprese salad made with heirloom tomatoes, basil, and bocconcini. Fascinating fact: the iconic shape of this bottle is inspired by an ancient vase found during a renovation of the winery. And what about red wine lovers at the farmer's market? The Lamole di Lamole Maggiolo Blue Label Chianti Classico is a bold and structured red with ripe layers of plum, black cherry, violet, and a whisper of Tuscan herbs. It's gorgeous with grilled eggplant stacks, layered with ricotta and roasted red peppers, or a rustic tomato galette. Fascinating fact: Lamole de Lamole's vineyards date back to the 1300s and sit at some of the highest elevations in Chianti. That altitude gives the grapes natural acidity and freshness. The estate uses organic farming and amphorae clay vessels for fermentation, a nod to ancient methods meeting modern finesse. Thank you for showing us how to bottle the farmer's market freshness this summer. Where can we find you and these wines online? On Instagram, I'm at Natalie McLean Wine, and online, my website is at nataliemclean.com. I've also posted links to these wines in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/348. Back to today's episode. 3 of you are going to win a copy of our guest's terrific new book, A Season for That, Lost and Found in the Other Southern France. I also still have 2 copies of Decanter Magazine's new book, The Ultimate Travel Guide for Wine Lovers. If you'd like to win a copy, please email me and let me know you'd like to win. It doesn't matter where you live. I'll choose 5 winners randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. In other bookish news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook or listening to the audiobook of my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, a national bestseller and one of Amazon's best books of the year, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'd be happy to send you beautifully designed, personally signed book plates for the copies you buy or give as gifts. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide, nataliemclean.com/348. Okay, on with the show. Steve Hoffman is a Minnesota tax preparer and food writer. His writing has won multiple national awards, including the prestigious 2019 James Beard MFK Fisher Distinguished Writing Award. He has been published in Food and Wine magazine, The Washington Post, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, among others. He shares 1 acre on Turtle Lake in Shoreview, Minnesota, with his wife, Mary Jo. They're elderly and entitled Puggle, he says, and roughly 80,000 honeybees. I forgot to ask a question, but I will about that, Steve. So great to have you join us. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Natalie. It's a huge pleasure. We've each read each other's books, and it feels like you probably know more about me than you wanted to, and maybe vice versa.
Yeah, I always get that feeling from people who've read books. It's like, okay, I'm really not that open a person. Right. But no, your book is marvelous. I cannot wait to get into it. But before we get there, your career journey has taken you from tax preparation to wine and food writing. Seems as logical as my own path, but what do these 2 wildly different careers have in common that attracted you to both of them?
Not much, honestly. I was originally a language and literature student. That was my first love. Qualified me for 0 jobs that would actually pay any money. So I spent a lot of the middle years of my life being a stay-at-home dad and finding careers that would pay the bills, basically. So the trip we took to France in 2012 was really a rediscovery of an early version of myself. And so the tax preparation and the writing and food writing careers are very separate in some ways. However, the one thing I would say is that they both involve actually being connected to people. And I know a tax office doesn't sound like that maybe is necessarily true, but it's actually a remarkably intimate place. It's a place where I talk or meet with 500 of my clients every single year. I'm involved in their lives. I see their lives unfold. They need to tell me details about their lives that are in some ways as intimate as what they would often tell their doctors. I need to know whether they have a job or not, whether they have kids or not, whether one of somebody is sick, how generous they are to charity, where their income comes from, et cetera. And so to that extent, there might be a little bit of a tenuous connection between my love of being connected to people and I think writing about them and also being involved in people's lives in a professional way do have a little bit of a story to tell each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that connection. And you may have mentioned this on a previous conversation, but did you compare the tax code to grammar?
Yes, absolutely. That is to some extent a connection as well, which is my original attraction to languages came through a love of grammar. That was how I found my entree into English and writing early on. And then taking French is also or taking any foreign language, I think, is a great way to be retaught the grammar of your own native tongue. And in that sense, yes, grammar requires you to memorize a certain set of rules and then apply them in a living way to the sentences that you're speaking or writing. And tax preparation is memorizing the United States tax code to the best of your ability and applying it to the very specific situations of your clients. So, yeah, memorizing and applying a sort of abstruse set of rules is actually a connection between my writing and tax careers.
I love that. So your book, A Season for That, is, as I said, a captivating journey through the Languedoc region of France. What inspired you to write about this region versus, as you say, the other southern France? And tell us what the other southern France is for those of us who don't know.
Sure. So we settled in 2012 as a family for an extended fall semester in the Languedoc region, which I refer to as the other southern France because it is, to some extent, the poor cousin of what most people think of as the southern France, and that would be primarily Provence and the Côte d'Azur, the Riviera, which was extensively touristed, and a lot of money got brought into that region by primarily British people who settled it early in the 20th century. And that didn't settle it, but made it their playground, I would say.
I think of Peter Mayle, A Year in Provence.
Yeah, Peter Mayle, Princess Grace, F. Scott Fitzgerald, there's kind of that wealthy playground element of that part of southern France. So there's money there, and Languedoc basically is the portion of Mediterranean France to the west of the Rhone. So the Rhone divides the country in two, similar to the way the Mississippi divides America in two. East of the Rhone is Provence and the Riviera. West of the Rhone is Languedoc and eventually Roussillon. We settled there in part because we're a middle-class American family and we didn't think we could afford to live for 6 months in Provence. So that's how we settled in, quote unquote, the other southern France. But I would also say that in the end, we had the kinds of experiences that we were able to have because we weren't in the grips of a tourist haven that is so good at grabbing you when you arrive and directing you into experiences that are tourist related rather than sort of human related.
I love that. So how long did it take to write the book? Is it about 10 years? 10 years,
10 years, yes.
2012.
10 agonizing years, yes.
Wow. What were the major hurdles? Agonizing. What agonized you most?
Two things primarily. Well, first of all, there was the simple fact that publishing a book, there are a lot of gatekeepers between you and publishing your book. And so getting through those gatekeepers was one of the challenges. The other challenge was never feeling as if I'd quite done the experience justice. I knew when we left, Mary Jo and I both knew when we left that something powerful had happened while we were there, more than just simply integrating into a village. Something had happened to me personally in my middle-aged development that we recognized but couldn't put words to. So taking those years were necessary for me to actually get to the heart of the story. And then ultimately, it's as simple as I was a fairly good writer of short pieces, 1,000 to 2,000 words, and the skills and craft necessary to keep a reader's interest and tell a deep and rich story over a book's length was something that was beyond my skills early on. And it really just took a lot of that time for me to at first admit that I couldn't do it and then seek out the help I needed to be able to do it.
Yeah, I found that too, the challenge with my first book. At first, I just wanted to string together 10 long magazine articles.
Exactly.
This is 10 long magazine. You need a through arc or whatever.
Correct.
Yeah, so that is tough.
I struggled with that same thing, with making it cohere. I laugh with, and Mary Jo says the same thing. I can cough twice and 2,000 words will appear in a Microsoft Word document. Like I don't even have to think about it. It's so natural. And so to unlearn that kind of, oh, let's wrap everything up with a pretty bow after 2,000 words rather than, oh, no, wait, let's leave things such that the reader wants to turn the page and find out what happens next. That was a very difficult mental shift for me.
And what were the through arcs for you, or the major through arc? Was it your transformation as a human being?
I think the original story that then eventually turned into the memoir, the original story was a very Peter Mayle-esque kind of travelogue. We were here. There was the chronology of how long we were there. We had some kind of very interesting experiences. We got deeper than usual into this part of the world. That was the original story. The parallel story that made it a memoir, the operating word I used as I was trying to imagine what this book should be about was acceptance. And so there is what I think of as the external story of our family's acceptance into this village. And then there's the internal story of a middle-aged man's finding some form of self-acceptance at age 45 that he hasn't been willing to afford himself for a lot of his adult life.
I love that. Yeah. And that's what moves people because, as you know, like with a memoir, I'll probably never go live in France for 6 months, but I can identify with your journey of self-acceptance. That's a journey a lot of people take.
And the other important, difficult part of that was that for that to be a journey, you need to start in a place where you're not fulfilled, where you haven't accomplished what you want, where you're in a state of ignorance and incompletion. And then you have to guide the readers, but also expose yourself and be vulnerable and show that you don't know it all at the beginning, or the ending doesn't have any emotional resonance. So that was the other difficult part, was sort of breaking down my own ego to some extent so that I could show myself as a very flawed person early in the book in order for the reader to feel a sense of catharsis or whatever at the end of the book when I kind of do step into myself in some ways.
And that's also what people identify with, our human vulnerabilities and frailties and
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
You did it well.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how did your experience change the way you approach food and wine writing in the Languedoc, being there?
Well, it's a very stark before and after story. I was not a food and wine writer at all when we arrived. I had kept journals during our travels over the years. I had dabbled in writing at various times. When I was a stay-at-home dad specifically, I tried writing some short fiction and poetry. That was terrible, and I hope it never sees the light of day. What happened in 2012 is that I kept an extensive journal. It ended up being over 100,000 words, describing what was happening to us on a day-to-day basis and trying to make scenes and stories and vignettes out of the little adventures that we were having daily. And it was 3 of those journal entries that eventually got crafted into 3 food writing pieces for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. The year we came home, those pieces ended up winning a National Food Writing Award. And suddenly I realized, oh, wait, this dream since my adolescence of being a writer might actually be within my grasp. And that really began my food writing career. So that journal is the start of my food writing career. There was not such a thing prior to our arrival.
Wow. So you basically started at the top with winning the MFK Fisher, then reverse engineered your way back to...
I didn't quite get to MFK Fisher immediately. That was several years down the road.
Okay.
But yes, it was a different award. But yes, it was a crazy sort of... And again, that sounds like a Cinderella story. He writes in his journal and then suddenly he's an award-winning food writer. But to be honest, that was the result of an awful lot of work in my very young adulthood, in college and after college, studying literature, paying attention to good writing, reading lots of writers that I loved, writing in a careful way almost my entire life. And so when I took it back up and wrote those journal pieces, that was not somebody with straw behind his ear who had never written anything before or never been interested in writing. I was deeply interested in that whole world for a time and then just couldn't follow through on it because there was no way to, like I said, pay all the bills and try to be a writer early in my life.
Okay. And how did the experience of the Languedoc improve your understanding kind of sensuality? You talk about this and how to capture that into words.
That's a great question. And I think it really came from that journal. We would have an adventure, or we would go to a butcher shop, or we would go to a market, or we would meet a winemaker, and I would write about it. And then we would do the same thing, or I would make a similar dish that I had made previously that I described earlier in my journal. Now suddenly I have to describe that again in a way that doesn't simply repeat the way I did it previously. And so that dailiness of journaling and the requirement that I describe things once and then again, and then maybe again, required me to see and feel and pay attention to the experience of eating and of experiencing wine, it made me go several layers deeper. And often those third or fourth descriptions were the best because I'd gotten beyond the initial, you tend to leap to cliches first. And then you think beyond those cliches and ask yourself, well, what am I actually feeling? What are the sort of chords of memory that are actually being struck for me personally, rather than just this tastes funky or this tastes like cherries or this was delicious. So I really think it was that writing over and over, it became a kind of practice that really made me a better writer.
That's great. Well, it's like for many artists, like Picasso had his blue period and they'll go at one topic, or like the bales of hay or whatever in the fields for, was it Van Gogh or somebody? And he kept doing it and doing it with different light at different
Exactly.
times of the day. And you're right. It's like what ballerinas do at the bar, like, plie, 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 plie.
Yeah, Monet's water lilies, right? It's an
Yes.
obsessive attention to the same thing and taking small things seriously enough and with enough respect that you try to describe them as absolutely accurately as possible. And that training really began in that journal.
Yeah. And it's those small little gems that build the beautiful
And that will
piece.
make a whole scene come alive. You can describe it well and it can have forward sort of narrative momentum. But for me as a reader, it's those moments of magic where the prose just sparkles and fires something in your brain where you make a connection like, oh my God, I've never thought of it that way. That's such an exciting moment for me that I love trying to create that myself.
It is. And MRIs show that different parts of our brain fire up depending on which sense we're evoking or like even reading about. So, yeah, you
Correct.
are
Yep.
using different parts. Now, speaking of beautiful writing, you've referred unkindly sometimes to your own writing as circus writing and your love of beautiful phrases, some of which had to go because they didn't move the story forward. How did you learn to kill your darlings? I guess some people attributed that to Hemingway, but I believe it was Arthur Quiller Coach. How did you learn to have that balance of the beautiful phrases and the keeping the story going? Or was it just practice and
No, there were a couple of turning points there. There's a parallel. The story of our time in France is to some extent a story of me slowly having my ego ground down. There's a kind of arc that goes down to a certain amount of crisis or a certain loss of faith in myself or loss of who I thought I was that then is rebuilt later. And that process, and Mary Jo, my wife, is a sort of lovingly strict taskmaster when it comes to showing me myself when I'm full of myself. And one of her phrases is to get over yourself, Stevie. You have to get over yourself. And so I had to get over myself as a French speaker and lover of France.
was there a moment when it came to that sort of crisis or whatever, or did she say something that sort of was the turning point?
There was an early turning point in the story and in our experience where I thought things were going great. And I was looking forward to sitting in cafes and speaking beautiful French and charming my neighbors. And she said, Stevie, this isn't working. And what she meant was, you're turning this into the Steve Hoffman show, and I and the kids are starting to feel like extras. You need to make something happen here. The kids speak French, but they can't do this. They're not adults, and I don't speak French. So if you want to continue this love affair you have with France, something has to happen this time, or I'm not interested in France. I can go to Madrid. I can go to Austria. I can go to Spain. I could be happy anywhere. So that was very much a turning point. And then there were several efforts to sort of cook my way into the village and to try to charm my way into the village. And those eventually just failed in a very transparent way. And I was faced with that kind of, I call it the 12-step rock bottom moment, where you admit that you have a problem and you have to change the way you think about things in order to pull yourself out of that. So that happened in the story itself in terms of our journey from arriving as strangers and leaving as friends. But it also happened as part of the writing of the book, which was I was in love with my own ability to say things beautifully. And at some point, that had become a form of showing off, not a form of connecting with readers or communicating to readers. And so there was one very specific turning point. This is 7 years into the book now. I believe I'm just around the corner, and I just simply can't believe that the American publishing industry hasn't recognized my genius yet. And I had a coach who said, Steve, you're a beautiful writer, but nobody cares. And they don't care
Ouch.
because I know, it's just like, that's a bad moment. That's a bad thing to hear 7 years into a project. But it was really the turning point that turned it into a publishable book and a book that I could be proud of. Because she was saying, similar to Mary Jo, you need to get over yourself. You need to get over how in love you are with your own words and your own ability to describe things and your turns of phrase. You need to start giving the reader the respect and the service they deserve of offering yourself in process, of offering yourself incomplete, and of being much more vulnerable and much more open, and either telling the truth or being in the process of trying to understand the truth about yourself. And that was really the difference between, again, this being a very light toe dip into Mediterranean France like Peter Mayle, and it being what I think it turned into, which is kind of a rich story about a man and a family.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. I so identify with that, using the beautiful phrases as a shield. That I did and still do, unless I catch myself, try to use sort of slapstick humor as a defense. And it's a way of not being vulnerable, of not presenting your whole self, and just like, again, tying everything up in a lovely, beautifully written bow or a whatever.
Right. Yeah. It's a kind of defense mechanism. It's a shield, but that shield then stands in the way of you connecting with other people. And at some point, if you're going to write a memoir, you can't be that person. You have to be a different person.
Exactly. It's about that human experience. Now, what was the most important thing your editor, a much respected cookbook author, Francis Lamb, taught you?
Well, he taught me that you can always cut more.
Oh, cruel Francis.
There's always something else you could cut. And I am still embarrassed to admit the length of manuscript I originally turned into him, thinking that there was some way we could make something. It was twice the length that I had been hired to write.
Oh.
No, not quite. No, not quite. It was 1.5 times.
Okay. So what was that length like versus what was the final book length?
My contract asked for 90 to 100,000 words, and I turned in, actually, no, it was twice. I turned in 180,000 words. I turned in more, 2 times the number of words. Again, in love with my ability to say things. At first, he literally said, I can't even look at this. Like, I don't have time to look at this. You need to get it. And so my agent and I said, this has to change. So I went back to the drawing board. I cut 50,000 words, got it down to 130,000. And then I believe the final manuscript was 115,000 words. So we got very close. But, he delivered some very bad news over and over and did it in such a smart and caring way. He's such a brilliant editor in that way that he was able to deliver these just hammer blows of, nope, that we got to get rid of that, or nope, I think we can get rid of this, or nope, I know how much you love this, but it can go. It's not serving the story. And I would fight internally, but I'd eventually find that he was right more often than not. There are a few things I fought back on and insisted on, but he was very good at showing me how cuts could continue and it wasn't going to make this into something I wouldn't recognize.
Yeah, the only way I could cope with that when I was writing is create another document called Future Book. And I thought, I'm going to use all this stuff. They'll come calling wanting a sequel. It's I haven't looked at it in years.
Nope,
anyway.
Nope. And yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, that's a good strategy. And I did some similar things. I actually literally went through and had a hashtag where I would highlight passages, call them darlings.
Yeah.
And then put them off to the side and figured, I'm going to get back to my darling someday. And I have not. In fact, the interesting thing is I now read the book. I feel as if I can still find places where I could have cut a little bit more.
Yeah. It's that distance that you need. So I think we've kind of covered this, but I was listening to another conversation you were in, and you said you needed to become not just a better writer to finish the book, but a better human. I guess that was more about your self journey of getting over yourself and just...
Yep, that's very much what we talked about just a minute ago, which is this idea of having to be vulnerable, having to accept your flaws and accept that people are willing to look at your flaws and still think you're an okay human being.
Yeah, okay. I also love your concept of travel. You talk about it, that it's become for many people consumption rather than sort of staying put and experiencing the place. You have a great phrase called collecting capitals, like been there, done that. Okay, there's the Leaning Tower of Pisa and whatever. Is it just part of our consumer culture, our instant gratification? What's going on with that?
I think it's partly that. I think it's also that people are being sold the idea that their lives are boring and that they need relief from their lives. And so we have this duality where we have our lives, which we're taught to believe are not worthy. And then we have these escapes, whether that's retirement for some people, where you've worked all your life and you hated your job, but now, damn it, you're going to enter your retirement and be happy. Or there are these vacations, or travel is another form of that, where, okay, your life sucks, but you're going to go have a great time for a week or two. And I feel as if, Mary Jo and I have had a phrase for a long time where we talk about trying to lead a life that you don't need to vacate. That your life itself if you are careful about it and a little bit intentional about it, can be the thing that you want to dive into every day. So, yes, I do think there's a consumer element to it. I think there is an element of people believing somehow that they need to escape their lives and that there's some better life over here if I just show up there. And then I just think there's a certain fear of boredom. Like Americans really want to go have fun. They want to be entertained. They like manufactured entertainment, or Las Vegas is like that, or Disney is like that, or even many resorts are like that. You're going to play pickleball, and then you're going to go have your Mai Tai, and then you're going to go by the pool, and your day is sort of almost planned for you from the start. Most people think they're going to go have the travel experiences that we had, but they set themselves up in such a way that they will never have that experience because they're too afraid that they're not in the right place, that they're going to get bored, that staying in one place is not going to be fulfilling or rich. And I had the opposite experience, which is I would much rather talk to our next door neighbor in the village that we lived in, who has lived in the same house for his entire life, but who can talk endlessly and beautifully about what it means to live in that place, to grow vines in that place, to make wine, to participate in that Southern French Mediterranean culture. I would spend all day talking to him rather than listen to somebody else tell me about the things they did in Moscow or Paris that a million other people have done to exactly the same degree of depth.
That's true. That's true. Yep. And that also can be what a bad memoir is. I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did that.
Correct.
No one cares.
Right.
Yeah. You also said it was a journey about coming back to yourself, some really interesting observations. You also mentioned Richard Onley, the late great American cookbook writer who you admired, and he lived in Provence, the main southern France for 30 years. And he said, go somewhere else and be somewhere else to recommit to where you're from after you travel. I think that happened for you, but maybe you can elaborate. Did you recommit to Minnesota or to who you were, but in a new way? Or
it's a great quote. And I do love Richard Onley. We can maybe talk about that at more length at some point. He's an idol of mine. I've actually visited the home where he lived in Provence. It's still there. It's being kept up by a groundskeeper, a sort of a maintenance guy who lives there and takes care of it. I'm friends with his brother who still lives in Minnesota, actually. But anyway, yes, that definitely happened in my case. I would say I didn't go with that intention. I went with the intention of trying to escape myself. I thought I was an uninteresting, upper Midwesterner who was going to escape himself and step into his fully formed identity as a French villager. I didn't have the wisdom of that quote, which is you go, but then you come back to yourself. Against my will, to some extent, that did happen. And I would say what I recommitted to or had recommitted to by the end of that book was the core of the most important people in my life, which were the people who were surrounding me while I was there. It was Mary Jo, my wife, and my two kids. And I thought we were going to all discover how wonderful it was to be someone other than ourselves. And by the end of the book, I'm cooking for and valuing and then essentially agreeing to leave France for these people, because a season for that really refers to the ending of the book where I'm accepting that there are not just seasons to the year, but seasons in a person's life. And this is my season to be a father and to be a husband. This is not my season to be a French villager. Maybe that will happen someday. And if so, there will be a season for that. But that acceptance, that coming back to yourself that you're talking about in that Only quote did very much happen in that way. The part of what the village taught me and my experience there taught me was that nothing matters if the core doesn't matter. All of the beautiful experiences on the perimeter of your life don't matter if the core isn't strong, and there is a recommitment to those core relationships by the end of the book.
absolutely. I don't know if it was Tennyson, but somebody said to begin where we started and know that place for the first time or something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sort of
Correct.
that circular
Correct.
thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you took your two children with you, as you mentioned, who at the time were 9 and 14. How did they react to being uprooted and going to rural France for 6 months?
Well, one was a preteen, or one was an early teenager, and the other was 9 years old. So they reacted very differently in the sense that she was a teenager with all the self-certainty of a teenager, believing for sure that she was being put upon by being forced not to have lunch at her school lunch table, but actually be in southern France. Then Joe was a pliable, sensitive, nature-loving young boy. And I think he was kind of ready to do whatever he could to be with us, basically. The interesting thing about that question, though, I think, again, we often think of travel as a way of being somebody else, of being somebody new, reinventing ourselves. And what I observed in the two kids was that what they actually did was adapt the circumstances to who they already were. Joe was already a little budding scientist and naturalist and nature lover, and he plunged into the nature of this place. And Eva was already a strong willed, self assured young person who imposed that will on her surroundings. And I think it was fun to watch them actually be themselves in a new location rather than change to try to be what the location wanted them to be, if that makes sense. And in some ways, there was almost more wisdom to that in for them than mine, which was I did really believe I was going to leave and become a new person. I believed I was going to re-inhabit this young man who lived in Paris in my 20s and who was, speaking French and operating competently in a world capital. That's who I wanted to be. And that was somebody other than who I was at the time. So I just thought it was interesting. This idea of travel being an escape versus travel being a place where you are yourself with new experiences in a new location, and that you get to be yourself in sort of wondering and investigatory way in a new place.
Yeah, absolutely. Living, as you say, with an openness, a vulnerability, and a curiosity. Living, as they say, maybe it's cliche, but living the questions, not the answers.
No, I think curiosity is one of the keys to this whole experience. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. And as you said, you were trying to live a life, or not just living a life, but trying to model it for your children. Like that must have been pretty profound for them to see the transformation, even if they weren't as acutely aware of it as you and your wife were. They would have known something was happening. And
I think they recognized that something happened. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And can you share any insights about French parenting or family life that struck you as very different from American parenting?
There was a book about French parenting that came out a number of years ago that talked about in France, they refer to it as le cadre, which is a frame. I don't know if you've seen that. So I'd read about this idea, but then I did very much see it in action, which is the French parenting style. And of course, this is a gross simplification of a huge diverse country. But the French attitude about parenting is that inside the frame, there's all kinds of behavior that's normal for kids and that can even be a little bit disruptive. And anything inside that frame is allowed, but you cannot step outside the frame. So there are certain things that are absolutely forbidden. And we did very much watch that. Kids were really allowed to be kids there. But then you would see that they understood that in certain settings, certain things were not allowed. We would often watch, we'd go out for a lunch on a weekend, and there would be an entire French family at a table nearby with kids from very young, 2, 3 years old, up to teenagers who were quiet, well-behaved, talking, participating, not unhappy, not sulking, eating a fairly broad range of what was served to them. And it didn't look like they were little automatons who were being, their whip was being cracked over their heads. It was that this is what life was. You get to be a kid. You can be a kid to whatever extent you want to be within the frame of this setting, but you can't go running around and screaming, and you can't refuse what's put in front of you. And if your grandmother asks you a question, you answer her. It was beautiful in many ways. The other thing I would say that I really loved and witnessed a couple of times is the tradition of the Sunday lunch, where multiple generations of a family would gather most Sundays around a table. And that was sort of the hallowed and sacred family time. It was just something really beautiful about that gathering and about reconnecting, that often with the people in your life.
Did you take some of those traditions or rituals back with you, maybe adapted them, but back home?
I think we had tried to adapt some of that frame idea into our own parenting. And we definitely, if we haven't really done Sunday lunch because it just doesn't lend itself well to American life, but certainly the idea of some regular gathering around the table and eating something that we have cooked together, and where the conversation is the point rather than the meal being the point, and then you all go off to your separate corners of the house. That really did linger, and I think is still a part of our family in a good way.
I'm getting some great ideas here, too. Canadians can be very rushed as well. It's like fueling versus,
Yeah, I mean, Mary Jo and I talk about Thanksgiving in the U.S., which is supposedly the feast where we all gather and sit around a table. It's one of the very few occasions where Americans sort of commit to doing that. And yet, if you watch most American Thanksgivings, it's everybody's talking and watching the football game, and then they all go to the table, and they all eat really fast. And then there's no courses. It's all on one plate, all piled up on top of each other. You eat your turkey and potatoes and vegetables, and then you all go back and watch the football game again. It's like, so yeah, there was something about the French willingness to let conversation be the point, be patient with conversation as a way of passing time that was really refreshing, that we really loved, and that we've definitely tried to sort of incorporate into our own family.
That's great. So why did you choose the village of Otignac, I think it's called?
Yep, Otignac.
Otignac. Why that one? Like, there's lots of little French villages in Languedoc, so...
It was somewhat random. There was a certain sort of intentional randomness about it. Mary Jo and I have always liked to challenge ourselves by kind of going underprepared to places and then figuring out what the place wanted to tell us. So there was a bit of that. We knew we wanted to be somewhere south because we're from the north, we're from Minnesota, and so we wanted there to be relatively warm. So it was going to be Mediterranean France. Languedoc was more affordable, was the only thing we could probably really afford. And then it was a question of sending a bunch of emails and hoping to get a response pre-Vrbo, pre-Airbnb. The other thing I would say, though, is that we had had an earlier experience in Brittany in the early 2000s. And as part of planning that trip, there had been several villages or cities, small cities, in the guidebooks that looked really interesting. And there were some kind of impressionist artists who lived in some of the cities along the Brittany coast. And in the end, we had not gone to those places. We'd gone to a place that was about 1,200 people. And what we discovered while we were there was that that was about the right size for us. Too many fewer people was just going to be like, it was going to be like living with an extended family. There probably weren't going to be merchants and butchers and grocers, etc. But too much more than that, you start suddenly getting maybe into the territory where this is a city that shows up in guidebooks. And then you have an entirely different makeup of the sorts of people who would visit there. So we did also try to limit our search to villages between about 800 and about 1,500 people. And we figured about 1,000 was the golden mean. That was kind of our target. And it turned out to be about right. 800 people, which was the population of Otignac, was a little bit small. It wasn't quite enough to sustain all of the commerce that ideally you would want to be reliably permanent in a village, but it was really close. It was still about the right size for us.
Cool. Now, let's see. The scene at the Café de Commerce sets the tone for the cultural differences. Maybe you can tell us about that and how these initial experiences shaped your approach to immersing yourself in that local culture.
Yeah, I feel like that first scene is sort of the first tolling of the bell that I don't recognize for what it is, which is, this is not going to be what you thought it was going to be, Steve. You imagined something a little bit romantic. You imagined something that would fit itself into your existing skills as a French speaker and a human being. And this whole book is the process of unlearning those things and then relearning. The way I think of it, I guess, is that I arrive with a preconception of what this should be. There's a lot of breaking down of that preconception in the first part of the book until I sort of stop talking and start listening, if that makes sense. I stop imposing and begin accepting. And the turning point really in that process, in that movement, is more toward the middle of the book when I asked to be part of a grape picking crew and start working in the vines and working in a village winery. That is the moment where I feel as if I stopped trying to tell the place what I thought it should be and started listening to what the place wanted to tell me about what it was. And then at that point, it wouldn't shut up. There was sort of an eloquence about everything around us that wanted us to know more. Our friends, our fellow grape pickers, the winemakers that we made, the merchants and vendors, and the fishmonger and the shellfishmonger. Once we started asking questions and being ignorant and full of wonder and expressing, not just with our words, but with our whole attitude, how interested we were in this place, everybody started wanting to tell us more about this place. And so, in the end, it's this sort of irony that you feel like you'll learn the most by showing people how much you know so they'll respect you and want to share their information. And in fact, it was just the opposite. It was when we were our most openly vulnerable and wondering and full of wonder that we gained the most knowledge, true knowledge about what this place was about.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Steve. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, how do you create a life you don't need a vacation from? Well, Steve says we're often sold on the idea that our lives are boring and we need relief from them. So we have these escapes, whether it's retirement for some people Or, you've worked hard all your life, hated your job, but now you're going to enter your retirement and be happy. And then there are vacations where you're going to go and escape that dreaded job and have a great time for 1 week or 2. He and his wife had a phrase for a long time that they were determined to lead a life that you don't need to vacate. That your life itself, if you are carefully crafting it and are intentional about it, can be a thing that you want to dive into every day. I love that. Number 2, what can we learn from the French about slowing down, savoring meals, and making conversation the heart of gatherings? Steve talks about Thanksgiving as one of the very few occasions where he and his family commits to slowing down and making conversation around the table and a great meal the point of getting together. And yet, if you watch a lot of Thanksgivings, whether it's in Canada or the US, everybody's talking, watching a football game, and then you go to the table, you eat really fast. It's all on one plate, all piled up, and, gobble, 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 and it's over. There's something about the French willingness, he says, to let conversation be the point and to be patient with the conversation as a way of passing time that's really refreshing. Love that too. And number 3, what's it like living in the other southern France? So Steve explains that he and his family went in 2012 for an extended fall semester to the Languedoc region, which he refers to as the other southern France because, to some extent, he says it's the poor cousin of what people think of as southern France, primarily Provence, the Côte d'Azur, the Riviera, which is extensively touristed and gets a lot of money brought into the region. Of course, Peter Mayle, Princess Grace, F. Scott Fitzgerald made it famous, a wealthy playground. Languedoc is the portion of the Mediterranean France to the west of the Rhone. The Rhone River divides the country in two. East of the Rhone is Provence and the Riviera. West of the Rhone is Languedoc, and eventually Roussillon. They couldn't afford to live for 6 months in Provence, so in the end, they went to Languedoc, and he firmly believes he had better experiences not being in the grips of a tourist haven. In the show notes, you'll find a full transcript of my conversation with Steve, links to his website, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. If you missed episode 115, go back and take a listen. I chat about Bordeaux with award-winning author Jane Anson. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. You've also mentioned that 70% of wine in Bordeaux used to be white or sweet. So was it the British influence that caused the flip to the red?
I love that question. So those 300 years when it was English, it was mainly red. The English basically preferred red wine, drank more red wines. The switch in Bordeaux came after the English left, when the Dutch came, because the Dutch have always been much more interested in white wine. But then from 1972 or 3, it switched to red. And today Bordeaux is 90% red wine. We tend to think of Bordeaux as being such a kind of traditional, unchanging region. But then just that one statistic tells you Bordeaux is perfectly capable of changing and adapting to what consumers want.
Oh, that's a great insight to draw from it. And the fact that they remain outward focused with an international focus.
You're right. That's a really good point.
You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Steve. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell a friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'll be interested in learning more about getting the most from living abroad for an extended period. It's easy to find the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemaclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or if you'd like to win one of 5 copies of the books I have to give away. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this episode, or if you've read my book or are listening to it. Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Food and Wine Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemaclean.com/class. And that's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/348. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that you paired with a long and deeply satisfying conversation. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.